On January 29th, about a month prior to its live-action release, Avatar: The Last Airbender released what I personally consider to be the most disastrous string of interviews I've seen in years, with these interviews prompting no less than 4 separate fandom controversies within the span of just 2 weeks. And yet at this point in time, the show has been renewed for not only Season 2, but Season 3, prompting the question, well, exactly how disastrously could those interviews have gone when the show is objectively a massive success? Which is a valid question, and while although it's correct, I'd argue that although the show has exceptionally high streaming numbers, it's lost a substantial amount of goodwill amongst its original audience, who showed extremely vocal displeasure regarding the changes that were made. The controversies themselves vary, ranging from fear at the announcement the show would be altered to be a bit more like Game of Thrones, a show people automatically associate with unforgettable acts of physical and sexual violence and likely did not want the age-accurate cast of a live-action Nickelodeon cartoon to experience, to disdain regarding the omission of Sozin's comment. But of all these controversies, the one that gained the most press and fandom backlash by far was an announcement concerning the alterations that would be made to a main character's sexism. Yet what started out as valid complaints and criticisms has evolved into a complete distortion of what this character is and what his arc ultimately turns out to be. So, without further ado, let's talk about Sokka, his sexism, his larger development, and why I think this particular announcement struck such a strong chord. For those completely unfamiliar with the original cartoon, Sokka is the older brother of Katara, the main female protagonist, and remains a prominent figurehead throughout the entirety of the series. And while though he certainly has a valuable position in the group, Sokka unfortunately has fallen victim to what I deem the comic relief curse. What is the comic relief curse, you ask? Well, it's basically the idea that if a character is comic relief, any of the complexity they otherwise possess will either be discarded by or completely forgotten by the audience. These characters have a horrible tendency to be either reduced to shallow traits, such as liking a particular type of food, or singular, brief scenes in the show with no consideration for how those scenes tie into their overall arc. And Sokka, as the only non-bending child in a group of bending prodigies, is tragically no exception. For years, the Avatar fandom has reduced his role into one of the following categories: a funny boy that loves to eat meat, Lemur Momo's babysitter, or a misogynist whose ass-whooping is actually the thing that prompts world peace. And while admittedly entertaining jokes, there are genuinely audience members that don't see any further depth to his character. Now, when the show begins, Sokka does have a sexist attitude, but is sexist in the way you would associate with any obnoxious and slightly tone-deaf 15-year-old boy. This is not a comment meant to diminish the risk this type of mindset poses, as it can easily evolve into something genuinely dangerous, and Sokka is right on the cusp of the age where it can do just that. This is simply to clarify to those unfamiliar with the cartoon that Sokka is not a frothing, raging misogynist. Because if I were completely unfamiliar with the show and saw the way that people rhapsodize about his sexism and toss around the claim that removing it would be to destroy the character in its entirety, I would be under the impression that Sokka was significantly more malicious in the cartoon and was like that for the majority of the show. When in reality, Sokka is sexist for only 4 episodes of a 61-episode show, and his sexism largely consists of an ignorant and childlike view of what the natural order of things is. That's not to say the lesson he learns in the show isn't important, it's to explain what Sokka's sexism actually looks like. The world of Avatar has always had an excellent understanding of the fact that people are products of their environments, especially children. Azula is aggressive, controlling, and cruel because she is raised by a man who associates those qualities with strength. Toph is often at first abrasive because she has learned that is how she has to be if she wants to be taken seriously. Sokka, naturally, is no exception to this phenomenon. His views on women are heavily shaped by the roles that he's seen modeled for him throughout his life. Although you could definitely argue on whether or not the Southern Water Tribe has as extreme a patriarchal society as the Northern, in which waterbending women are exclusively constricted to the role of healer, there are still distinct, clear divides concerning the tasks that each sex is expected to perform. Sokka doesn't randomly develop the idea that women are, by default, better at mending and menial household tasks. He believes that because prior to meeting Aang, that was all he was ever able to see a woman be. In the same breath, the show also takes care to showcase the risk that allowing this type of mindset to go unchecked poses by providing us Pakku, a perfect example of how silly adolescent sexism can evolve into an oppressive adult sexism. While Sokka is misinformed over malicious, it would be extraordinarily easy for his mindset to shift from the natural order of things is for men to fight and women to nurture, to and men are superior for their role and women inferior for theirs. It's not until he meets the Kyoshi warriors, a group of warrior women that can not only hold their own in combat, but outright best him, that Sokka realizes the world is a far larger and more complex place than he previously thought it to be. At this point in the story, Sokka yearns to be a warrior and hunter, but doesn't have any of the traits that would allow him to excel in either. Whereas these warrior women he encounters beautifully embody the qualities that he most craves, bravery and honor. In deliberately humbling himself before them, Sokka is not only able to expand and improve his worldview, but finally begin taking the necessary steps to become the man he wishes to be, reflecting that Sokka's sexism doesn't stem from outright disdain of women so much as a deep and profound sense of insecurity over his ability to fulfill the role expected of him as a man. Southern Water Tribe men are viewed as warriors and protectors, and yet Sokka's mother, the most important woman in his life, is killed due to what he likely perceives as his and his father's inability to protect her. To make poor matters worse, when the men of his tribe go off to fight, he is left behind due to his age, leaving him feeling even more helpless and powerless. And to just top everything off, his sister is the one that inherits a special ability uniquely associated with combat, whereas he doesn't have any such power. Some compensate for the insecurities that such a chain of events would likely foster by retreating inwards, but Sokka copes by projecting outwards. His largest and most consistent flaws throughout the series are his pride and stubbornness and ego, with him likely harboring the idea that if he projects this image of ideal masculinity long enough, he'll be able to assume it for himself. This is largely due to the fact that Sokka also doesn't have a figurehead to model what he ought to aspire to. He simply has archetypes from the past, and his arc centers around him recognizing what he truly wants to be. As the Avatar masters the elements, Sokka masters the unique combat styles associated with each of the 4 nations. But his development isn't exclusively centered around physical ability and strength. He learns how to strategize, he learns how to become a more efficient tactician, and most importantly, he learns in what moments it's most important to not engage in combat. All this is to say that unlearning sexism is simply the first part of this extremely large arc and is by no discernible means the crux of it. So then, you may ask, what is with this fan outrage? Well, despite being a relatively minor part of his overall character arc, an arc that follows 4 episodes of a 20-episode first season means that it comprises at least 20% of the development that he undergoes in the first season. Sokka unlearning these ideas was approached in a grounded and realistic fashion that stemmed from his real, lived experiences. After facing the reality of what the world looks like and the potential the people within it can have, he begins to broaden his perspective and reevaluate his former hard stances. However, I'm actually of the opinion it wasn't the announcement that incited this fan outrage so much as it was the wider implications of its phrasing. To be totally frank, the nature of Sokka's sexism would need to be changed for a live-action adaptation, simply because in the cartoon, Sokka's sexism is often interspliced with slapstick comedy, which, although humorous in animation, would likely come across as unbearably corny in a live-action remake that's already clarified they crave a more realistic, mature approach. In order for the lesson to stick, Sokka's sexism would need to be tweaked to be subtler, and something a little more akin to what we'd see in our day-to-day lives. That's not to say its severity ought to be tweaked, it's just that it should be slightly less overt. That, personally, is something I believe that the majority of fans would have understood and accepted. Even if the sexism had been potentially cut for pacing purposes, that too would have been understandable. Netflix's live-action adaptation of Avatar is 8 episodes in contrast to Season 1's 20, which means that if they were adapting the source material beat for beat, each live-action episode would have equated to 2.5 to 3 cartoon ones, meaning that Sokka would have learned this lesson by live-action episode 2, which is something I can easily see not boding well with audiences unfamiliar with the original cartoon. It would be very easy to perceive this lesson as being one learned far too quickly, as the overwhelming majority of people don't unlearn sexism one day to the next, and might have been perceived as condescending, which either would have required them to extend the arc or cut it. But those weren't the explanations that were provided, with the statement being that Sokka's sexism would be altered because it was iffy and had aged poorly, when Sokka's sexism is never framed as being a trait the audience is meant to receive well. It's not framed in the show as simply an endearing, lovable quirk. It's framed as being something that makes an otherwise extremely intelligent character look like an ignorant buffoon. The very idea the show would be catering itself towards audiences that believed the depiction of a social problem was an endorsement of it was, to many fans, cause to sound the alarm. Because such a significant recurring theme in Avatar is learning to overcome your previous biases by interacting with groups of people you otherwise wouldn't have. If Sokka's playground sexism was deemed too much for modern audiences to handle, then how would the show approach its much darker themes in a tasteful and effective fashion? And furthermore, if the live-action series expressed they would be removing traits they felt that modern audiences would perceive as problematic, then how would they approach depicting the more unpalatable flaws of our protagonists? The answer came with the release of the live-action itself. They wouldn't. The live-action adaptation has numerous major flaws, but the biggest in my eyes is its apparent fear of allowing its main characters to have any flaws whatsoever. When first discussing the news of the removal of Sokka's sexism, I made the remark that although it wouldn't destroy his arc in its entirety, it would soften it, and compared it to making Aang immediately ready to accept his duties as the Avatar over starting out a frightened and overwhelmed child, or having Katara intuitively understand that although the Fire Nation killed her mother, Not every member of the Fire Nation is an irredeemable, evil person over having her express visible rage. Not knowing I was apparently a seer and accidentally spoke both of those changes into reality. This isn't just a Sokka problem, because with every character, it seems the writers had a keen awareness for what flaws were commonly complained about. But instead of analyzing why exactly those flaws existed, they decided to remove them in their entirety. Take Katara, for instance. Justifiable rage is replaced with meekness. Deep-rooted grief is replaced with reluctant understanding. Vocal frustration becomes quiet passivity. And the common thread linking all these traits together is that all these things were things Katara's character was heavily criticized over. A vocal minority of people openly perceived Katara's defiant and domineering nature as bitchiness, her trauma as whiny and attention-seeking, her willingness to speak up as obnoxious and over the top. And in attempting to satiate these criticisms, the show has created a character utterly unrecognizable. These removals ultimately cause the complex, nuanced characters we're familiar with and have grown to be fond of to be almost unbearably bland, which leads me to the biggest issue that I personally have with this new iteration of Sokka. And that isn't that he's not sexist, but that the traits that fueled that sexism, pride, ego, and insecurity, aren't there anymore. That brashness has been extracted. Instead of showcasing the immaturity these insecurities foster, he is now framed as being the more mature sibling between him and Katara. He's still an overprotective older brother, but the qualities that have fueled that protectiveness have been changed, stemming from a moral obligation to step up and fulfill this role over a fear of failing to protect his sister in the way that he couldn't protect his mother. While I'm not sure why this approach was undertaken, I can only hope it has something to do with the showrunners' fears of the show potentially not being renewed. And now that it has, I can only hope that they will have more courage and truly allow their characters to be flawed, instead of infallible, perfect godchildren. But that is something I suppose we will simply have to wait and see on. Thank you so much for exploring the world of Avatar with us, and if you enjoyed, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. And here's an extra special thank you to our Patreons. If you would like to count yourself among them, the link is in the description. Thank you so much for your time, and have a fabulous day.